All right, continuing on with part two of our lecture on Louis XIV and Western absolutism, we're going to look now at the development of French absolutism. So we have two objectives for this section. First, we're going to explain how absolutist forms of rule affected social and political development from 1648 to 1815. And also, after we study this section, we'll be able to compare the different forms of political power that developed in Europe from 1648 to 1815. So, for example, it's likely you will be asked to compare this with English constitutionalism or Dutch constitutionalism or absolutism in Eastern Europe. That's something that the AP is likely to ask about. Our key concepts, there's several for this section. The first one, Louis XIV and his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, extended the administrative, financial, military, and religious control of the central state over the French population. The second one, across Europe, commercial and professional groups gained in political power and played a greater role in political affairs. And the third one, the rise of mercantilism gave the state a new role in promoting commercial development and the acquisition of colonies overseas. And number four, the monarchies seeking enhanced power faced challenges from nobles who wished to retain traditional forms of shared governance and regional autonomy. And finally, sometimes we will see that states exploited religious conflict to promote political and economic interests. And again, the major theme for this section is going to be political. So let's talk about the foundations of absolutism in France in the 17th century and understand some important context. So in the feudal tradition, which of course came from the Middle Ages, French society was divided into three estates made up of various classes. While we sometimes saw the three estate system in other parts of Europe, it was most prevalent in France and it lasted the longest in France, well into the modern era. So again, the first estate in this system is the clergy. They only made up like 1% of the population. The second estate was the nobility. They made up 3 to 4% of the population. And the third estate was the bourgeoisie, the artisans, the urban workers, the peasants, basically everyone else and their mother. And they made up the vast majority of the French population. And this hierarchy of social orders, which was based on rank and privilege, was restored under the reign of Henry IV. So this is the type of system where there was really no social mobility. You were born into the same estate that your parents were, and your children would remain in that estate, as would your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, and so on and so on. In addition, France was primarily agrarian. That means agricultural. About 90% of the population lived in the countryside and worked in agriculture. So that means most of the French population were peasants. And its population of 17 million made France the largest country in Europe in the 17th century. This was about 20% of Europe's total population. And so not surprisingly, this accounted for France becoming the strongest nation in Europe. Now, after the French Wars of Religion, Henry IV became the king of France. This is good King Henry. Also, you might remember him as Henry of Navarre, who won the French Wars of Religion. And he laid the foundation for France becoming the strongest European power in the 17th century. He's a very famous, very beloved French king for all of that. So he strengthened the social hierarchy by strengthening government institutions, such as the Parlement, and which are councils of noble judges, the treasury, the universities, and the Catholic Church. So again, he reinstituted the three estate system and supported these institutions that would in turn support the system that supports the monarchy. He was also the first king to actively encourage French colonization in the New World. This stimulated the Atlantic trade. And one thing I do want to clarify really quick, that word in italics you see, parlement, it looks like parliaments, but it is not a parliament like we see in England. Notice how it is spelled differently. When you see it spelled this way without the I, this is a French court, like a judicial court. It is not a legislature like we see in England. So just please make note of that difference because you will see that term used again in this lecture. Now, Henry IV was the first king of the Bourbon dynasty. Remember, they replaced the Valois at the end of the Wars of Religion. He came to power in 1589 as part of a political compromise to end said French Wars of Religion. And even though he had been a Protestant leader during the wars, he converted from Calvinism to Catholicism in order to gain recognition from Paris for his reign. France, especially the people of Paris, were unwilling to accept a Protestant king, so Henry IV had no problem converting to Catholicism, and in doing so, he famously said, "Paris is worth a mass." And one of his greatest accomplishments is that he issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, providing a degree of religious toleration to the Huguenots, the French Calvinists, and thus bringing an end to at least some of the worst conflict surrounding the Wars of Religion. But the Edict of Nantes was really religious toleration in the most basic sense. It was toleration of their existence. It was not acceptance truly of religious pluralism. And we will see that that has ramifications later on. In establishing the foundations of absolutism, Henry IV worked to weaken the nobility, which again is a key characteristic of any successful absolute monarch. So, for example, the old nobility of the sword were not allowed to influence the royal council. Now, when we talk about the nobility of the sword, we're talking about the old medieval nobility with land and titles and generations of privilege. And so these were the ones who were not allowed on the royal council because they were the ones who traditionally had the most power and therefore would be most likely to challenge the sovereignty of the king. So as a result, many of the nobles of the robe, these were new nobles who purchased their titles from the monarchy, became high officials in the government and remained very loyal to the king. We talked about this characteristic earlier. And one of the most important examples of that is going to be the Duke of Sully, who we'll talk about in just a moment. Remember, the nobles of the robe were usually commercially successful members of the bourgeoisie, so like upper middle class merchants and businessmen and bankers, and they now wanted to raise their social status, and they could do so by working for the government, and this allowed them potentially to purchase titles or be awarded titles so that they could become members of the second estate with the nobility of the sword. So I mentioned the Duke of Sully. And the Duke of Sully plays a very important role during the reign of Henry IV. This is the finance minister of France. And his reforms, his financial reforms and economic reforms, enhanced the power of the monarchy. Sully was a supporter of mercantilism. So you might remember that mercantilism is one of really the dominant economic system of the 16th, 17th, and to some extent the 18th centuries. That was practiced by most European states, especially the European states engaged in Atlantic trade and world trade and things like that. So mercantilism, by using mercantilism, Sully increased the role of the state in the economy, so he had more government control of the economy in order to achieve a favorable balance of trade with other countries. Again, the whole idea behind mercantilism is you want to protect your precious metals, your bullion, and so you want your exports to be greater than your imports. You want to sell more than you buy. So in order to achieve this, Sully granted monopolies in the production of gunpowder and salt to certain companies. He encouraged manufacturing of silk and tapestries, encouraging the growth of French industry in the 17th century, and he even had the government monopolize mining. And mining was a really profitable industry because this led to weaponry and many other useful items. He also reduced the royal debt, which was very, very important. He used modern systems of bookkeeping and budgeting, And this is a significant contrast to Spain, who at the same time was starting to drown in debt and would ultimately never recover. Sully also reformed the tax system to make it more equitable and more efficient. He oversaw improved transportation. And so this really helped to rebuild the infrastructure of France following the destructive wars of religion in the late 16th century. So to improve transportation and therefore improve commerce and trade within the borders of France, he began a nationwide highway system. He built canals that linked major rivers, and he even began a canal to link the Mediterranean Sea in the south of France to the Atlantic Ocean in the north of France. So all of these economic policies were really, really important for establishing a strong financial base that would support this authoritarian monarchy headed towards absolutism. So things were going really, really well until Henry was unfortunately assassinated in 1610 by a fanatical monk who sought revenge for Henry's granting of religious protections for the Huguenots. Like I said, the Edict of Nantes was really religious toleration out of necessity. It was not acceptance, and definitely, as you can see, not everyone in France accepted this religious pluralism that the Edict of Nantes allowed. So the king was assassinated. This was tragic. People were really, really upset. And so this also led to a severe crisis in power because Henry's son, Louis XIII, was not old enough to rule. And so therefore, Henry's wife and the mother of Louis XIII, Marie de Medici, yes, from that Medici family, ruled as regent. And we will see that the French don't always respond well to queens ruling as regents. And this kind of opened the door for some nobility to potentially challenge the monarchy. We simply don't have that strong authoritarian leadership that we saw in Henry IV. So there's going to be some challenges for a while, especially in the early years of Louis XIII's reign. But overall, I really want you to remember that Henry IV is viewed as one of the most popular and beloved kings in French history. Good King Henry. The economy was so good that it put a chicken in every pot, which meant that everyone had something to eat for dinner. So people really, really loved him. And also, he laid the foundations for the growth of state power that his successors, like Louis XIII and Louis XIV, would build upon to make France the most powerful nation in Europe. So now we're moving on to Louis XIII, not the 14th yet. So as a youth, his regency was beset by corruption and mismanagement. Like I said, the unexpected assassination of Henry IV had created a severe crisis in power, as feudal nobles and princes tried to increase their power in the absence of leadership. It even got to the point where certain nobles convinced young Louis XIII, once he was a little bit older, to assume power and exile his own mother because his mother was accused of corruption and favoritism. And like I said, the people of France don't often respond well to queens acting as regents. But really, we're not going to spend much time talking about Louis XIII because he did not assume a lot of the responsibility of the leadership of France. That job fell to Cardinal Richelieu, his chief minister. So Cardinal Richelieu is a really, really important figure in the tradition of absolutism. He laid the foundation for absolutism in France. So a little background on Cardinal Richelieu. He was actually appointed as the chief minister of the French government by Marie de Medici. So as the chief minister, he essentially is in charge. He's calling all the shots. And he created policies that strengthened royal power and led to a larger bureaucracy and increased revenue. So as a result, Cardinal Richelieu is often viewed as a very Machiavellian ruler. He's portrayed as the villain in the Three Musketeers novel and movie, if you've ever read that or seen that movie. Tim Curry plays an excellent Cardinal Richelieu, very villainous, of course. But Richelieu's motto as a leader of France was as follows. He was famous for saying, "Where the interests of the state are concerned, God absolves actions which, if privately committed, would be a crime." So I'll say that again because I think it's important for understanding Richelieu's personality. Where the interests of the state are concerned, God absolves actions which, if privately committed, would be a crime. So again, that reminds you most likely of Machiavelli. So moving on, like Henry IV, he was technically a politique in the sense that he placed political issues ahead of religious principles. This was one of the reasons the French joined the Protestants in the 30 Years' War. However, one of his best accomplishments as a leader of France, one of the ways he really was able to consolidate royal power was by creating the Intendant system. So France was divided into these generalities, it looks like generalities, which are like different districts or provinces. And each of these generalities was led by an intendant. It looks like intendant, but it's French, so you say intendant. And this was a system that Richelieu used to weaken the nobility and expand the power of the central government. So these generalities were monitored by these government officials known as intendants, and these intendants reported directly to the king. And also, these intendants were dependent entirely on royal favor for their position. So these are example of this would be like the nobles of the robe, right? They were largely middle class or minor nobles, and so therefore they vigorously supported the king and they supported the monarchy. And so each of these countries' 32 districts or generalities had an intendant responsible for justice, police, and finance. They basically were the eyes and the ears of the state in these different districts, and they executed the commands that came from the central government, but they also reported back to the central government. And so the government became more efficient and more centrally controlled. Richelieu also built upon Sully's economic achievements in further developing mercantilism and developing a strong, solid economy for France, which, like I said, will really differentiate them from Spain. And his increased taxation was used to fund the military. So this allowed France to build up a big, powerful military. So that's the positive. But the negative is that the tax policies were not as successful as the Duke of Sully's were. The Duke of Sully's tax policy had actually lessened the burden of taxes on the peasantry, but Richelieu does the opposite. He allows tax farmers to ruthlessly exploit the peasantry, and he also resorted to the old system of selling offices, selling government offices and titles as a means of raising revenue for the state. In regards to foreign policy, Richelieu focused on the arch nemesis of France, which were, this isn't foreign policy, this is domestic policy about religion. I'm getting ahead of myself. In regards to religious policy, Richelieu and domestic policy, Richelieu actually subdued the Huguenots, not the Habsburgs. We'll get to them in a moment. So yes, he's a politique, but he also viewed religious minorities as a possible source of dissent that might defy state authority. So in the Peace of Alais in 1629, Huguenots actually lost their fortified cities and Protestant armies that had been allotted to them through the Edict of Nantes. So he doesn't revoke the Edict of Nantes. So the Huguenots are still allowed to practice their religion, but they're just not allowed to have fortified towns, which are like big walled off towns, and they're not allowed to have armies. And I mean, if you're Richelieu, you can understand why this might be perceived as a threat to royal power. So this also means that Calvinist aristocratic influence was reduced, and Calvinist aristocrats were seen as one of the greater threats to power. But like I said, they were still allowed to practice Calvinism. The French government has not gotten rid of Calvinism, at least not yet. And now we move on to foreign policy. So Richelieu's foreign policy focused on weakening the Habsburgs. This was ultimately why France decided to join the 30 Years' War in the later years. As you might remember, the Habsburgs are a traditional arch nemesis of France dating back to the early 16th century. And so when the French joined the 30 Years' War, they did so on the side of the Protestants, despite being a Catholic nation, because they were willing to do whatever was necessary to weaken the Habsburgs. So in this sense, yes, Richelieu is a politique because he's putting politics above religion. But also, this foreign policy reversed Marie de' Medici's pro-Spanish policy that we had seen from France briefly in the early part of the century. And Richelieu even declared war against Spain in 1635. And this will set up a long rivalry between France and Spain for most of the 17th century, and it will also allow France to ultimately dominate Spain and emerge as the leading power in Europe. France also supported Gustavus Adolphus with money, even before the French phase. This was during the Swedish phase of the war. And like I said, when France finally entered the last phase of the war, which is sometimes referred to as the international phase, although we referred to it as the French or Franco-Swedish phase, this allowed them to more or less win the war and force the Treaty of Westphalia on the Habsburgs. This wasn't a decisive victory. It's not like they vanquished the Habsburgs, but the Treaty of Westphalia definitely benefited the French and hurt the Habsburgs. And so French participation in the 30 Years' War resulted in increased centralization of the government and the economy. However, it also created economic issues due to excessive spending, because of course war is expensive, and this increased social tension in France that would have ramifications in the early years of the reign of Louis XIV. So now we have finally arrived at Louis XIV, the most famous king in all of French history. Louis XIV is the quintessential absolute ruler in European history. Like, no one is going to be as good of an absolute monarch as Louis XIV. Like, he sets the standard, and frankly, all other absolute monarchs that follow him are just trying to be half as good as he is. And this is because he really personified the idea that the sovereignty of the state, that means the power, the leadership, the identity of the state, resides in the ruler. And one of the mottos we associate with the rule of Louis XIV is L'État c'est moi, which basically means I am the state. So Louis XIV is the state. He is France, and that is it. He represents France. He is not just the king, he is France. L'État c'est moi, I am the state. So really think about what that means and what type of message that also communicates to the people of France. He also became known as the Sun King. You definitely want to remember this. Louis XIV, the Sun King, since he was the center of French power, just like the sun is the center of the solar system. This replaces the traditional symbol of the French monarchy, which is the fleur-de-lis. You can actually see that symbol on this magnificent fur cape that Louis is wearing. The fleur-de-lis was a lily, and that was a really masculine, powerful symbol to represent the French monarchy. So Louis XIV decided to fashion himself after this idea of the sun, radiating power and energy and excellence. And so that really defines his reign as the King of France. He is, of course, a strong believer in the divine right of kings, this theory advocated by Bishop Bossuet. And this is probably because ever since he was born, he was told by everyone around him, and especially his mother, that he was God's gift to France and that God had chosen him to rule France. So if he's being told this from day one of his life, then yeah, he's going to believe that he truly was chosen by God to rule France, that he is the son of France, S-U-N and maybe S-O-N. It's a double meaning in some ways. Louis XIV is also famous for having the longest reign in European history. He lasted for 72 years because, like I said, he inherited the throne when he was like 5 years old, from his father, Louis XIII. His grandfather had been Henry XIV, but the first 18 years or so of his reign was a regency where he did not rule in his own right yet. His mother, Anne of Austria, was the regent until he came of age, and Anne of Austria, like Marie de Medici, chose a chief minister to essentially run the government for her. And the chief minister for this period was Cardinal Jules Mazarin. So under the leadership of Louis XIV, France became the undisputed major power in Europe through his modernized, state-controlled military. This was really one of his greatest accomplishments. So because France had such a large population, this meant that they also could have a massive standing army. They could create and maintain this massive standing army. So we will see that France has like the biggest, most badass military in Europe. And of course, Louis is going to use that to be at war constantly. Also, during his reign, French culture will come to dominate Europe. Like France becomes the cool place to be. For the French language became the international language of Europe for over 2 centuries and the language of the well-educated. So this replaced Latin as the sort of lingua franca, meaning the common language of Europe. And France became the epicenter of literature and arts until the 20th century. So the definition of style and fashion and luxury all came from France. And I just like to finish this slide by highlighting one of Louis's key mottos. And this is really important. I want you to highlight this, circle it, underline, or something. This idea of one king, one law, one faith. This really embodies the ideals of the reign of Louis XIV. One king, one law, one faith. This is all about what he tried to achieve as an absolute monarch of Europe. So as we study the reign of Louis XIV, I want you to look for examples of how he created this idea of one king, how this was just one law, and how also he managed to implement one faith. So one of the most important events in Louis XIV's reign actually happened very early on when he was still a child. And this was something known as the Fronde. So the Fronde occurred immediately after the 30 Years' War, as you can see. This was when Cardinal Jules Mazarin controlled France as chief minister while Louis was still a child. A little bit about Mazarin that I think would be helpful for context. Jules Mazarin was Richelieu's trained successor. So Richelieu trained Mazarin to succeed him as chief minister of France. And Mazarin therefore continued Richelieu's centralizing policies. This also meant that he continued the French participation in the 30 Years' War. However, Mazarin was not quite as Machiavellian and successful as Richelieu, and he was resented. He was well resented by the nobility because not only was he foreign, he was born in Italy, but also there were accusations that he used his political power to create a noble fortune, a personal fortune for himself. So he was foreign, he used his office for his own personal gain, and also there was a scandalous rumor that he was having a sexual relationship with Anne of Austria, Louis's mother. How scandalous. Anyways, this was enough fuel for the fire to allow some nobles to revolt against Mazarin when Louis was a child. So the Fronde is a revolt of the nobility against the French government. That's the definition in a nutshell. So the Fronde is this big revolt, this big rebellion of the French nobility against the French government. And this all took place when Louis was a child. And this was actually like really, really traumatizing to Louis, as we will see. So ultimately, this ended because civil war among the various noble factions allowed Mazarin to defeat the nobles, but the nobles had wanted more control. There were protests against taxation. There were, and basically what they were protesting and what they were rebelling against were the absolutist tendencies of the government. So the nobles didn't like absolutism. All right, the nobles like feudal monarchies because in feudal monarchies, the king is dependent on the nobles for a lot of power. And so these nobles did not like the centralizing policies of Richelieu. They did not like, the new economic tax system. They did not like the generalités and intendants. They did not like the buildup of the military, of the state-controlled military, in fact. And so they were essentially rebelling against the absolutist tendencies of the state. But like I said, what's significant about the Fronde is that it scared the crap out of little Louis XIV. And he never forgot about the Fronde. So Louis XIV and his mother had to flee Paris. They had to move several times around France for their own safety. So this was really traumatizing to Louis. And so he never forgot this humiliation and this trauma that he faced at the hands of the nobility early on. And so this really ingrained this determination in him to control the nobility. And so that becomes really one of his major objectives as King of France, is how can he control the nobility? But also the Fronde was really disruptive to France. There was factionalism and popular riots and rebellion and chaos. And this ultimately left France wishing for peace and for a strong monarchy. So let's dive into the actual reign of Louis XIV. So in terms of government organization, Louis recruited his leading ministers from the middle class in order to keep the aristocracy out of government. Like I said, he did not trust the nobles. He did not want them in his inner circle. And even though it says chief ministers there, I do want to clarify that Louis did not utilize the typical chief minister like his predecessors. So, for example, Richelieu and Mazarin basically ran the government instead of the king or instead of the regent. But Louis was not going to allow that. He was directly involved in the day-to-day issues of the government. So he did not have an equivalent of Cardinal Richelieu or Cardinal Mazarin to rule the government for him while he was off like hunting and sleeping with his mistresses and things like that. So he was very, very involved. So he continues the intendant system begun by Richelieu, because again, that was really effective at centralizing royal power. He also checked the power of French institutions that might resist his control. For example, the Parlement, so judicial courts, were pretty fearful of resisting Louis after the Fronde had failed so spectacularly. He also arrested officials who criticized the government. Again, that's where the secret police could be useful. And also, he never called the Estates General into session. Now, remember, the Estates General is the parliament, like the legislature of France. And it's called the Estates General because it's made up of different representatives from the three estates. But it is not ingrained and baked into French culture and tradition like the Parliament of England. This is why England struggled so much in the 17th century in developing constitutionalism and why the Stuart kings were ultimately unsuccessful with absolutism. But there was not that same strong tradition of parliamentary sovereignty in France, and so Louis avoided working with Parliament by just never calling them into session. So this, again, in France, the Parliament is known as the Estates General. And I just want you to keep this in the back of your mind about how the French kings like Louis are never calling the French Parliament, the Estates General, into session. They are ruling on their own. And just think about the long-term effects that may have on France. All right, but that's going to be another story for another day. Louis also wanted to establish control over the peasantry, which accounted for about 95% of the population. Some peasants were only allowed to keep as little as 20% of their cash crop after paying their landlord, their government taxes, their tithes to the church. So they only had 20% of their crop to either keep for themselves to eat and store or to sell for a profit. Louis also instituted something called the corvée or the corvée. I don't know, it's French. And the corvée required forced labor of peasants to work for a month out of the year on roads and other public projects. So basically, this is the government saying, hey, for 1 month of the year, You've got to come work for us and build roads or projects or do something like that. And if peasants appeared to be especially idle, they could be conscripted into the army or forced into workhouses. And rebellious peasants could be executed or used as galley slaves on ships, which I can tell you was not a very fun job to do. So that brings us to our third and final section, which is the manifestations of absolutism in art and economics. I promise that this section is a little bit shorter than our first two. So our objective for this section is to explain how European cultural and intellectual life was maintained and changed throughout the period from 1648 to 1815. Our key concepts, there are a couple of key concepts from the last section on economics that are applicable here as well, but some of the other ones that we can include. So the first one says, the arts moved from the celebration of religious themes and royal power to an emphasis on private life and the public good. And until about 1750, Baroque art and music promoted religious feeling and was employed by monarchs to illustrate state power. And so the major themes are not just political anymore. We're also going to look at economics and cultural and intellectual developments. So one of the most important things that we can associate with the rule of Louis XIV is his Palace of Versailles. I mean, frankly, you can't think of Louis XIV without understanding the Palace of Versailles. Under Louis XIV, the Palace of Versailles became the grandest and most impressive palace in all of Europe. And we're talking the fanciest of fancy palaces. This awe-inspiring scale of the palace reinforced his image of the most powerful absolute ruler in all of Europe. Now, Versailles had actually started as a small hunting lodge about 12 miles outside of Paris. It was then converted to a chateau. And then Louis decided to transfer his court from Paris, where it had been in the Louvre Museum. So what is today is the Louvre Museum. That's the old French royal palace. And so Louis moved the court out of Paris and basically out into the countryside. This is like considered out in the boonies, like out in the sticks, and forced everyone to go live at the Palace of Versailles. And part of the reason he did this is because of the trauma he experienced during the Fronde and the violence and chaos he saw in Paris. And so he wanted to get his court out of Paris and separate himself from that drama there. More on that later. Back to Versailles. So the Baroque architecture of Versailles was largely the work of Marquis Louvois, and the gardens were designed by Laval, although Louis XIV was also very involved in the design and construction of the entire palace and gardens. And Versailles was so extravagant that the cost of maintaining Versailles was about 60% of all royal revenue. Now just pause to consider that a moment. That is 60% of all of the income of France is being used to maintain Versailles. So it's the king's residence and palace and the government offices. Like, that's a lot of money that is being used to upkeep this palace. There was also this beautiful, extravagant palace. It was magnificent. The facade was about a third of a mile long. Over 1,400 fountains adorned the ground. And when Louis moved the court from Paris, it grew from about 600 people, which had occupied the Louvre, to about 10,000 people at Versailles. Some reports say even 15,000 people lived in and around Versailles at its heyday. That includes everyone from servants to royal families to members of the nobility. And Versailles really set the standard for the rest of Europe. It became like the coolest, fanciest palace in all of Europe. And it was incredibly influential in fashion, culture, etiquette, but it also is considered political propaganda because the purpose of the palace was to glorify Louis XIV as the Sun King and to enhance the power of the absolute monarchy. So let's take a moment to explore a few images of Versailles in this lecture. Ooh, look at how fancy that is. all the gold facade, the black and white tile floor. Now, this is just a small snippet of the entryway, the main entry into the palace here, but you can start to see how fancy and ornate it is. Here is more of a bird's eye view of how extensive that palace became. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of rooms, all of which were extremely fancy. And even behind the palace, you can start to get just a glimpse of the gardens, which are much larger than the palace. Here's a better view of the gardens that extend for many, many acres. I don't have the specs right in front of me, but you can walk for miles and miles in these gardens. It's full of fountains and fancy topiary. These days, some of the fountains are synchronized to opera music, and it's just magnificent. And as you walk around, just imagine yourself being a member of the hoity-toity French nobility, and you're dressed in the latest fashions, and servants are bringing you champagne, and you're gossiping with your friends about who said this, and they did that, and this person slept with that person, and oh my gosh, can you believe this? Well, did you know that the king approves of blah, 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 and oh my goodness, I mean, it is worse than high school. Like, however bad you think the gossip could be in high school, I can assure you it was 10 million times worse in Versailles. So Versailles Palace became, in effect, a pleasure prison for the French nobility. Louis made Versailles like so awesome and fancy and decadent. The nobility like begged to be at Versailles often. And this is also how Louis gained absolute control over the nobility. So because he was fearful of noble intrigue, meaning he didn't want the nobles to be out in their country homes plotting rebellions against the king, he actually required nobles to live at the palace for several months each year so that he could keep an eye on them. But also, Versailles was so fancy and so awesome that the nobles often wanted to live at Versailles. So Versailles became home for thousands of royal officials and aristocratic families. And by engaging the nobles in the daily court life at Versailles, they were actually excluded from any real power. And like I said, the nobility was much more concerned with rival aristocratic factions, and they were consumed with gossip and fashion and parties and affairs and scandal. It was just the ultimate party house. And Louis made sure that these nobles were entertained with numerous recreational activities such as tournaments and hunts and concerts. There were operas and theatrical performances by the works of, which included the works of famous French playwrights like Racine and Molière. Louis himself also was a ballet dancer, and so he often liked to perform in these performances, operas and dances and things like that. And of course, the nobility fawned over him and told him how excellent he was as a ballet dancer. In addition to all this entertainment, Louis established these elaborate court rituals throughout Versailles, in which the nobility were expected to participate in. So, for example, every morning when Louis woke up, there was this elaborate dressing ceremony. So about 8:30 every morning, the royal attendants would walk into the royal bedchamber, and only the most privileged nobles would be invited to attend, and Louis would be woken. He would have an opportunity to use the chamber pot. He would get dressed. He would eat his breakfast. And it's said that one of the most privileged positions for the nobility was to be the person who handed Louis his shirt in the morning. There was a similar elaborate ritual with the dinner ceremony in the evening. Both of these ceremonies and rituals could last for hours. And you may be wondering, like, well, why the heck would the nobility, like, come watch the king wake up, pee in a pot, eat his breakfast? Why would they bother with all that? Well, the thing is, Louis manipulated the nobility so that active involvement in these rituals was a prerequisite for obtaining titles and favors and offices. So if you wanted anything from the king, you had to participate in this charade. And so as a result, life at Versailles was defined by elaborate order, ceremony, and etiquette. Louis literally created a situation where life around Versailles revolved around him. He, the Sun King, was the center of life, and everything revolved around him. Now, Versailles also had a pragmatic purpose. It functioned as the center of French administration. It was, of course, the primary residence for the king and his family. It was the reception hall for state affairs. In particular, the Hall of Mirrors was the most famous room in Versailles, partially because it was the most expensive. And this is where the most important events took place, whether they were balls or receiving of foreign dignitaries or whatever. And of course, Versailles had all the offices for the king's government, and all the bureaucrats and officers and people who worked for the king lived at Versailles with their families. So I mentioned the Hall of Mirrors, and so of course now we have to pause to check out the Hall of Mirrors, which is an unbelievably spectacular room. So here's a glimpse of the Hall of Mirrors, and as you can see, very fancy. We have gold, we have marble, we have crystal chandeliers, we have paintings on the ceilings. But the reason the mirrors in particular are so special is because mirrors were incredibly expensive in the 17th century, and therefore they were also extremely rare. So having a hall of mirrors, which is the ultimate way to flaunt their wealth, and this also, of course, reflects all the other fancy stuff, the gold, the chandeliers, the marble. So this is definitely the most spectacular room in all of Versailles. In regards to his religious policies, Louis considered himself to be the head of the French Catholic Church. Like I mentioned earlier, the French monarchy did a lot to try to control the church in their state. He's still Catholic, he's still very religious, but he did not allow the Pope to exercise any political power in the French church. So this also shows us how the Pope is really no longer the King of Kings that he once was during the Renaissance. Monarchs now have a lot more sovereignty over their country. But this also shows us how Louis is using religion as a tool for national unity. And this is probably best demonstrated by one of his most famous policies, the Edict of Fontainebleau. And the Edict of Fontainebleau essentially revoked the Edict of Nantes. It nullified it. It canceled it. It was over. So this meant that Huguenots lost their right to practice Calvinism. Calvinism was now illegal in France, and as a result, Huguenot churches and schools were destroyed. So the message that Louis was sending was quite clear, that you needed to convert to Catholicism or leave. And frankly, Louis never believed that toleration should be permanent. He thought it was just a necessary development to stop the violence, but he had no intention of allowing it to continue. And now that he was this absolute monarch that had more control over France, he didn't need the Edict of Nantes to keep those Huguenots in check. So about 200,000 Huguenots fled France for England, Holland, and the English colonies of North America. And later on, the Huguenots would give major support to the Enlightenment, which is going to be sort of a philosophical revolution in France in the 18th century, and especially the ideas of religious toleration. More on that later. And Louis also supported the Jesuits in cracking down on the Jansenists. So the Jansenists are a weird little religious minority. They were essentially Catholics who held some Calvinist ideas, and they had also been responsible for some of the rebellions and dissent in the years of the Fronde. And so they, of course, were seen as a potential threat to royal power, and so Louis worked with the Jesuits to kick those weird Jansenists out of France. We're almost done here. We're just going to take a moment to talk about mercantilism and the economy, which is also a really important component of Louis XIV's rule. So, as I mentioned earlier, mercantilism, potato, doesn't matter, was really the prevailing economic system for European states in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was based on this idea that the state control of a country's economy is necessary in order to achieve a favorable balance of trade with other countries. So mercantilism will require lots of government control of the economy. It's still about profit seeking, but the way they define profit is a little bit different. Mercantilism believed that in this idea of bullionism, this idea that a nation's policy of accumulating as much precious metal, so this is gold and silver, as possible, was necessary to prevent the outward flow to other countries. So the idea here is that they believe that there's a limited supply of gold and silver in the world, and a state needed to keep as much of that gold and silver in its borders in order to define its wealth. And so one of the ways it did that was maintaining a favorable balance of trade. And that means exports had to be greater than imports. Essentially, you want to sell more than you buy, so you get to keep your gold and other people have to pay you that gold. And the ultimate goal of mercantilism is self-sufficiency. And this is why colonies have always been so important in mercantilism. Now, French mercantilism reached its height under Louis' finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. You definitely want to remember who this guy is because he's really, really important. He was probably one of Louis' favorite ministers. He was an important member of Louis' inner circle. He was not only the finance minister, but he helped to direct the entire administration and taxation, manage taxation, and he also financed a lot of public works, meaning propaganda, to support the image of Louis XIV as Sun King. So, of course, Colbert's goal as the finance minister was economic self-sufficiency for France. And I gotta say, Colbert was really, really good at his job. He oversaw the construction of roads and canals, so this is this is a way to rebuild infrastructure and promote internal trade. He also granted government-supported monopolies in certain industries. He heavily regulated guilds to ensure the quality of goods produced. This is a really big important thing, is that he wanted to ensure quality control of French goods because France started to develop kind of like a luxury goods industry. He also reduced local tolls. These are like internal tariffs that could potentially inhibit trade. And the trade union that the internal trade union created was called the Five Great Farms to help promote internal trade across France. And he also organized French trading companies for international trade. So a French version of the East India Company and a French version of the West India Company, although they will never be on the scale as the British and Dutch versions. And finally, he forbade the export of foodstuffs. France was a very powerful agricultural state, and so he kept that foodstuff in France to take care of the population. So by 1683, France was Europe's leading industrial country. It excelled in industries such as textiles, remember that's cloth, especially fancy cloth, mirrors, lace making, and even established foundries for steel manufacturing and firearms in order to support the military. But Colbert's most important accomplishment was developing the merchant marine for the French. So the merchant marine are ships built for the purpose of trading. It's not a navy, all right? So these are just ships for the purpose of trade. And so this is what allowed the French to really compete at all with the Dutch or the British, especially with the profitable trade of North America. And even Louis's obsession with the military helped to stimulate the economy. This military buildup helped to stimulate the economy due to the production of uniforms, overcoats, weapons, and ammunition, which employed weavers, tailors, gunmakers, and more. However, there are some serious drawbacks to mercantilism and the French economy. So ultimately, there were very poor peasant conditions, especially the burdens of taxation lowered the standard of living for peasants. And so there was a large immigration out of France, especially to North America. And also, Louis XIV opted for creating a massive army instead of a formidable navy. So this really gave France a huge disadvantage against England. So later, France would lose important naval wars with England, like the Seven Years' War in the next century. And ultimately, war was the economic downfall of France. Even though Colbert was an excellent finance minister and he created the strongest economy France probably saw in the entire early modern period, at the same time, Louis was an expensive king. So Louis was obsessed with going to wars. We'll talk about that in our next lecture. And so he was at war for 2/3 of his entire reign. And war is expensive, and unfortunately, these wars nullified Colbert's gains. So, like I said, despite the fact that Colbert had a powerful economy, Louis was a very expensive king. And so we will learn about those wars in a future lecture about the wars of Louis XIV. But for now, thank you for listening. And thank you, Bowie, for cuddling and being a good audience as always. You may have heard some of his approving dog grunts in the background throughout this lecture. Have a good night, students.